Jesus displays a consistent poverty mindset through behaviors that combine deliberate simplicity with efforts to maintain authority over others. Growing up in Galilee, a region marked by basic farming economies, high rates of child death, and limited education, Jesus held a position of moderate advantage as the son of a skilled artisan, someone literate enough to reference religious texts, and viewed by his mother Mary as a promised leader. Despite this background, he describes wealth as a source of ethical corruption, such as in teachings that compare a rich person's entry into heaven to a large animal passing through a small opening. At the same time, he accepts expensive comforts, like being anointed with valuable oil equivalent to a year's earnings for a common worker, without objection. This pattern suggests a form of chosen restraint, where lack becomes a symbol of special status for those deemed favored, as seen in messages that highlight the value of humility without leading to real changes in living conditions. Such views continue because true sharing of power would challenge his role as the central figure. His acts of provision, like feeding a large crowd on one occasion, are limited and selective, creating ongoing need that encourages reliance and admiration. Wealth is criticized to remove potential challenges, as when a wealthy individual is told to give everything away, or followers are asked to abandon their work tools, leaving them vulnerable and focused solely on him. Hardship is presented as meaningful rather than addressed at its roots, with no efforts to change oppressive systems like taxes or fraud shortages in the area. Instead, economic difficulties are elevated as signs of inner strength, keeping people in positions of humility and expectation while he holds the key role as the provider of deeper meaning. Psychologically, this approach draws on a need for constant affirmation, where criticizing material success boosts his own standing, portraying vulnerability draws in support, and requiring full commitment ensures a steady flow of devotion. The actual struggles of the time, including food scarcity and foreign rule, serve as a setting for his messages rather than problems he actively resolves. Overall, this mindset appears as a way to guide others while masking control as living humbly. To understand the poverty mindset of Jesus, we must look to his upbringing. Mary's influence on Jesus' growth involves projecting her own unresolved issues onto him, shaping his sense of self through a form of self-focused parenting. In the setting of Nazareth, a small village under Roman control with unstable finances, early marriages, and strict social roles for women, Mary is shown without much personal background, family details, or independent actions in the main stories. The announcement of her special role, described as being filled with favor, acts as a boost to her sense of importance, turning her overlooked position into one of chosen purpose. Her song of praise reframes her low social standing as part of a larger plan that brings her recognition. Mary's song of praise, known as the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1, verses 46 to 55, functions as a strategic reframing of her social condition. She begins by declaring that her soul magnifies the Lord, and her spirit rejoices in God her Savior, because he has regarded the low estate of his handmaiden. This opening establishes her identity as a woman of humble origin facing public shame through unwed pregnancy. Rather than accept this disgrace as permanent, she interprets it as divine selection. The song continues with a vision of cosmic reversal. God scatters the proud, casts down the mighty from their thrones, exalts those of low degree, fills the hungry with good things, then sends the rich away empty. These lines transform her personal crisis into evidence of a larger redemptive plan. Her lowliness becomes proof of election rather than failure. The recognition she receives is eternal prominence as the mother of the Messiah. Future generations, she predicts, will call her blessed. This prediction fulfills itself through centuries of veneration. Women who later encountered the Magnificat inherit a model that morphs suffering into significance. Poverty, shame, and exclusion appear as prerequisites for divine favor rather than obstacles to overcome. This song thus supplies the foundational narrative for a theology that equates deprivation with destiny. Mary's praise constructs the template that her son will later embody and expand. A deeper psychological analysis of Mary requires explicit linkage between her internalized worldview and the formative dynamic she enacted while pregnant with Jesus. The idea of a birth without typical human involvement satisfied a profound narcissistic wish for transcendence, enabling her to transcend quotidian constraints and secure enduring significance by bypassing conventional familial bonds. Joseph appears briefly and quietly after an initial vision, then reduced to a minor part, while Mary connects directly to a powerful, distant paternal presence by bearing his selected child. Jesus grows up without ordinary childhood experiences, receiving gifts like precious metals and resins that mark him as a future ruler rather than a typical boy, treating him as an extension of her own elevated story. Her guiding hand shows in moments like when young Jesus prioritizes temple activities, only for her to redirect him back under her influence. Later, at a wedding event, Mary's instruction about the lack of wine leads to Jesus' public display of ability, with her words directing others to follow him, placing her as the one who initiates his public role and shares in the resulting attention. This pattern teaches him to perform acts of kindness in ways that emphasize show over lasting help, much like her desire for notice through his achievements. The passing down of this self-centered approach prevents balanced relationships, leading to his views on scarcity as a tool to keep others in lower positions. So, limited resources are presented as ideal to maintain ongoing need, such as in statements valuing those with little. Mary's hidden history turns into Jesus' assigned mission, where the combination of an undefined mother and a remote divine figure creates a child loaded with universal expectations. The repeating pattern of generous acts for praise, enduring pain for dominance, and seeking devotion for confirmation shows religious ideas as extensions of family patterns that prioritize appearance over real change. Jesus' outlook, based on Mary's projected needs, makes a rescue a staged event rather than a genuine fix, continuing a pattern of influence instead of true freedom. Jesus exemplifies a focus on being remembered over creating useful changes. Unlike those who quietly improved everyday tools, structures, or methods that benefit everyone without seeking credit. While death is a natural part of life for all beings without added meaning, he assigns his own ending a role in saving others, as in statements about the highest form of care being self-giving. This does not tackle real problems like conflict, lack of food, or unfair systems, but builds a story of lasting impact where being remembered leads to positive outcomes and being forgotten brings loss. Such thinking uses memory as a way to influence behavior, similar to ideas that self-importance comes from enduring fame. His acts, like providing food for a crowd, are one-time events rather than repeatable methods, emphasizing dramatic effect over ongoing benefit. Compared to the unnamed creators of essential developments in water systems, food production, or materials, he insists on constant attention, turning away from the quiet contributions that drive real advancement. This leads to a system that praises giving up on one's life as the greatest good, making personal loss a mark of special standing. The outcome is a focus on individual recognition sustained by hopes of future gains, embedding a need for notice into shared beliefs. As a result, people and groups now bear his name and legacy because he boldly transformed a defeat into a triumph. The Christian system maintains limited access to resources as a planned way to hold power based on the self-focused elements in Jesus' messages. Declaring those with little as favored sets up a ranked order that keeps people in place rather than lifting them up, making lack a required part of the path. This does not help those in need, but reinforces their lower status, tying them to a central rescuer. In the stories, certain individuals like Peter, John, and Mary gain special access to knowledge and roles, while others like Judas, as the blamed one, or Thomas as the doubter, serve as examples of what to avoid. The larger group acts as seekers of approval, trained to gain benefits through lowering themselves. Practices like asking for pardon embed a sense of needing to diminish oneself, making personal value depend on giving in to a higher will. Required giving and calls to let go of belongings turn spiritual commitment into financial ties, benefiting leaders who claim closeness to the divine while quieting those who question the claims of weak belief. This setup uses hardship as a tool, keeping influence through controlled limits. Jesus' end is shown as continuing a pattern that requires ongoing yielding, leaving people smaller in resources and mindsets. Prayer in Christianity acts as a repeating process that weakens one's sense of control and value. It involves feeling pain, admitting faults, asking for help, waiting long periods, facing unmet hopes, growing more upset, and starting over, which builds habits rather than bringing comfort. Turning to Jesus in prayer, as shown in text, demands accepting suffering as the way to gain notice, making giving up control the main way to matter spiritually. This system separates people from their family backgrounds, especially those whose traditions were altered by outside forces pushing Christian ideas. Prayer shifts focus from real fights for land, food, and towards a figure who gives no clear aid. The emotional weight, filled with senses of low value and being left behind, comes from the built-in loss of self rather than any true lack from above. The same fear of erasure of becoming Judas clarifies why Jesus required his death. The betrayal appears as foreordained prophecy, yet functions as personal panic. The act originated from a wounded ego. The only method to erase the reflection was to eliminate the reflector. Jesus experiences a deep internal sense of worthlessness, rooted in his fear of being erased or replaced. Rather than confront this fear within himself, he projects it outward onto Judas by labeling Judas the betrayer and orchestrating his death. Jesus transforms his private insecurity into a public act of blame. This single maneuver converts the threat of personal insignificance into the elimination of an external rival, making Judas the scapegoat who absorbs and carries away the original wound. Jesus' handling of Judas shows underlying jealousy and hurt pride rather than set fate. Judas acting as the group's money handler, showing skills in managing funds. He raised questions about lavish spending like the use of expensive oil. This ability points to a practical strength that Jesus lacks, as his work centers on meaningful symbols over steady planning. Instead of discussing Judas's sensible points or using his skills, Jesus turns the concern into a sign of wrong character, leading to predictions of disloyalty. This shift avoids facing his own limits, placing blame on Judas to keep his image of higher guidance intact. Making Judas the last symbol of betrayal sidesteps responsibility for group issues, turning a possible helper into an outcast. This reflects personal unease, typical of self-focused patterns that push away perceived risks. The ongoing negative view of Judas in tradition highlights a mental safeguard valuing image over teamwork or real improvements. Jesus' focus on scarcity questions ideas of flawless leadership, showing unease with possessions tied to his early life and carried into his messages. Texts show him as coming from a basic trade family in a pressured area under outside rule. Mary, described as chosen for a unique role, has no steady work mentioned, with Joseph fading into the background. Claims of noble heritage provide symbolic lift without real support. This likely led Mary to build a story of special purpose for Jesus to balance their lack, passing on a view where having little means spiritual height, as in calls to trade belongings for inner gains. His giving acts, like creating drink at a gathering or increasing food for many, are brief shows rather than ongoing fixes, favoring display over lasting setups. A leader skilled in resources might have created shared work for groups or taught handling money. Instead, he idealizes limits as blessings. This sanctifies need without ending it, keeping people tied to symbols over actions, failing to meet actual economic needs. Jesus' reaction to temple traders stems from personal aversion to wealth rather than systemic injustice, rooted in lived hardship under heavy taxes. Driving them out constitutes an intense rejection of monetary systems he neither understood or sought to reform. Rather than reshaping trade or lending, he treats riches as wrong in themselves, linking them to ethical slips. This lets him see his own limits as positive traits, freeing him from fixing real hardships. Followers like Judas, like previously mentioned, for money, and Matthew for taxes fill his gaps, while he views wealth as an enemy. He otherwise continues cycles of lack, leaving people without resources while honoring his guidance. From a social, psychological angle, Jesus uses tactics to hold power, as in claiming outcasts like service workers and collectors enter ahead of his group. This does not truly raise those groups, but weakens his close followers, including ones with similar pasts he brought in, creating rivalry and doubt to center himself. Like relational control, it builds ties through unease, pushing seekers towards his favor. On concrete challenges such as financial stability or strategic guidance, Jesus withdraws and prioritizes internal surrender over practical aid. This pattern indicates deliberate retention of influence through substitution of effect for action, which sustains follower dependence and uncertainty and reveals a pervasive poverty mindset that valorizes scarcity over resource management. Jesus shows a broad scarcity mindset in thinking, feelings, and connections, weakening his role, claims, and building a culture that sees setbacks as positive. Instead of owning limits, he uses stories to shift views, making flaws into lessons. This guards his sense of self while avoiding fixes, favoring symbols over changes. Criticizing riches, knowledge holders, and even his own through comparisons builds a system raising him while lowering others. This points to a self-focused setup masking lack with meaningful words, ensuring ongoing need. The effect on followers embeds a lasting view, glorifying lack and pain as favors, pushing acceptance of shortfalls over drive. Rather than growing leaders, it fosters waiting, using texts to evade facing wrongs. This establishes harmful relational dynamics in which submission to authority is equated with love and all failures are attributed to individual deficiency rather than systemic design. Communities focused on being special extend Jesus' emphasis on lack. People endure harsh conditions from his example of it as sacred. Jesus offered no guidance for constructing shelters, yet repeatedly highlighted his own homelessness. This omission crystallized into doctrine that job or home loss signifies proximity to divine ideals. Individuals processing prior trauma, diminished self-worth, or emotional instability interpret suffering as purposeful and perpetuate the cycle. Jesus offered minimal practical financial counsel. He sidestepped the responsibility of the mandated giving that derives from pre-existing Jewish law and delegated them to followers while claiming credit upon completion. His mother reinforced this dynamic by associating his designated role with exemption from consequences, sacralizing scarcity and obstructing skill acquisition. Followers internalize the role of enablers, deriving identity from proximity to the exempt leader, while the leader's detachment is reframed as spiritual elevation. He ultimately remains unencumbered while followers incur deficits. The pattern reveals extraction and a self-replicating hierarchy where labor is outsourced, credit is centralized, and accountability evaporates. Christian doctrines, particularly Jesus' valorization of poverty and submission, exploit ancestral survival heuristics. In ancestral environments, displays of deference secured group protection, resource sharing, and caregiving, forging a neural association between yielding and safety. The religious system co-opts this mechanism by linking low status and humility to deferred supernatural rewards, substituting tangible losses with symbolic compensation. In modern contexts, this adaptation malfunctions. It inhibits adaptive problem solving, reframing deprivation and isolation as spiritual purification rather than actionable deficits. Rational faculties recognize the irrationality of equating homelessness with virtue, yet affective circuits pursue the promised reinforcement. Individuals with histories of trauma are especially susceptible. They reenact scarcity as a mislabeled resolution of prior wounds. The process is a hijacking of evolved submission instincts, perpetuating cycles of lack under the guise of destiny. Jesus' mindset shows effects of Mary's uneven care, like traits of shifting emotions, building a split self between high worth and lack. Stories hint Mary switched from raising him as a key heir to handling poverty limits in the ruled area. This created insecure attachment bonds and predisposed Jesus to polarize self-concepts such as special yet low, omnipotent yet helpless, and chosen yet abandoned. These extremes emerged directly from Mary's inconsistent caregiving. She elevated him as a divine heir while simultaneously exposing him to material instability and social marginality in Roman-occupied Galilee. His behavior reflects this duality through assertive acts such as expelling merchants from the temple alongside displays of vulnerability, including public mourning at Lazarus' tomb. His teachings similarly blend omnipotent promises of provision upon request with directives to relinquish possessions, thereby enacting surrender. The resulting internal conflict produces a leadership style that demands absolute loyalty while modeling emotional fragility and resource detachment. These polarized self-concepts stem from Mary's projection of exalted purpose to compensate for her own marginalized status while simultaneously raising him amid chronic instability in Roman-occupied village. This mirrors golden child dynamics in narcissistic families where the designated heir absorbs grandiose destiny, yet remains deprived of practical competencies. Consequently, Jesus prioritizes symbolic gestures over structural solutions, pursues eternal recognition while clinging to material lack, and proves incapable of integrating perceived cosmic value with mundane reality. From a narcissistic personality disorder framework, Jesus exhibits covert hostility by prescribing financial divestment, disregarding material needs, and devaluing possessions as spiritually inferior, thereby transforming inevitable failure into moral triumph. Followers anticipate divine provision that remains perpetually symbolic, and when deprivation ensues, culpability is assigned to their insufficient faith rather than a flawed counsel or structural deficits. The narcissistic mechanism operates by imposing unattainable standards, observing non-compliance, and reclassifying deficits as personal failings, thus diminishing others to preserve centrality. The hostility is concealed beneath a veneer of humility. The process is deliberate subordination where followers inherit burdens, dependency, and blame, while Jesus retains idealized status. The promised inheritance for the meek is deferred indefinitely. In the present, they accrue only obligation. The dynamic constitutes sadistic supply derived from induced loss, framed as compassion. The statement in Mark 14:7, "The poor you will always have with you," constitutes a theological admission rather than poetic solace, signaling a deliberate abstention from addressing systematic poverty. This suggests a divine reluctance to intervene, raising the critical question: if endowed with omnipotence, why not eradicate hunger with a singular act? Instead, the directive to accept and endure poverty while maintaining moral uprightness reflects a managerial approach rather than a messianic one. A genuine revolutionary would have disrupted the temple economy, redistributed resources to the urban poor, or confronted Roman authority directly. In the argument that Jesus did not claim omnipotence, why not his Father in heaven, whom he is the same as? From a sociological perspective, Christianity establishes a hierarchical structure that perpetuates economic and psychological disparity among its adherents. The upper tier, comprising pastors, megachurch leaders, and televangelists, leverages scriptural promises of divine favor to cultivate a narcissistic persona where self-proclaimed anointment translates into material wealth. These leaders exploit the text's prosperity rhetoric, amassing resources while their followers, conditioned to accept deprivation as virtue, fund this disparity. The lower tier, consisting of devout believers, often born into the faith, internalized teachings such as the beatitude of poverty in Luke 6:20 and the directive to relinquish possessions in Luke 6:29. This leads to intentional economic self-sabotage, where adherents view homelessness or financial ruin as evidence of spiritual fidelity. The text explicitly endorses this mindset, with no counter-instruction from Jesus to pursue practical solutions. The design ensures the perpetuation of poverty among the majority, framing their suffering as divinely ordained. The narcissistic framework of Christianity filters success through grandiosity, rewarding those who claim divine selection without empirical validation. Only individuals with narcissistic tendencies thrive as they can assert chosen status and extract resources, such as tithes, from vulnerable followers. Those who are marginalized within the faith, scapegoats or outcasts, often form alternative chosen one communities, seeking inclusion in a system that previously rejected them. These communities do not represent liberation, but rather a continuation of trauma, as members replicate the hierarchical dynamics of Christianity, aspiring to be recognized as chosen. A psychological reenactment of learned dependency rooted in the religion's foundational structure. Jesus' teachings discourage material accumulation, such as in Matthew 6:19, and practical planning in Matthew 6:28, promoting a poverty mindset that aligns with his own socioeconomic origins in a resource-scarce Galilean context. This stance ensures follower dependency as wealth or independence threatens his authority. Instructions to give to the poor, like in Luke 12:33, redirect resources towards his movement, reinforcing his centrality while discouraging economic agency. When adherents achieve material success, teachings such as the impossibility of a rich person entering heaven in Matthew 19:24 reframe it as moral failure, maintaining their subordination. By withholding practical guidance, such as financial planning or systematic reform, Jesus preserves a power dynamic where his followers remain vulnerable, ensuring his position as the ultimate source of validation. This structure systematically disempowers, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities to sustain a cycle of devotion and deprivation. Jesus systematically devalues individuals with material or intellectual resources, as their autonomy threatens his authority. This pattern reveals a deliberate strategy. Jesus undermines those with resources or skills to maintain their subservience. By reframing wealth as spiritual liability in Matthew 19:24 and competence as secondary to devotion, he ensures followers remain emotionally and materially dependent. This dynamic prevents adherents from questioning the absence of a tangible kingdom or challenging his authority. Jesus exhibits signs of emotional arrest at a pre-adolescent developmental stage, shaped by inconsistent and idealized parenting, particularly for Mary, who internalized a divine narrative surrounding his birth. Rather than cultivating practical competencies, she reinforced a fantasy identity of son of God rather than carpenter's son, resulting in impaired reality testing concerning survival and resource management. His counsel reflects this detachment. Instructions such as "do not worry about tomorrow" in Matthew 6:34 assume automatic provision, and directives to sell all possessions presume others possess equivalent safety nets. His stance towards wealth stems not from malice but from experiential absence. When a wealthy inquirer seeks guidance, the response is total divestment rather than diversification, revealing the perspective of a privileged child who assumes liquidation is universally feasible. Narcissistic developmental arrest requires no hostility, only detachment. Concrete lessons in economics, labor, and planning were omitted, replaced by themes of magic, martyrdom, and messianic destiny. The outcome is doctrine that glorifies scarcity rather than alleviating it, rooted in infantile certainty. A mature adult persists in the conviction that reality functions like material bedtime stories, and contemporary adherents continue to bear the cost of that unresolved childhood. Jesus couldn't stand measuring up to real leaders like Roman engineers who built roads, or even Judas who tracked coins because he'd lose. So he built a fantasy bubble. I'm not competing with men, I'm above them. God's literal son. That way, no greater dad No smarter brother, no better boss exists. The poverty game keeps everyone small and keeps him tiring. Without it, he's just another Galilee kid who can't pay rent. Mary internalizes the message that her child's value lies in cosmic designation rather than an earthly competence. The boy grows up believing provision arrives through spectacle rather than actual labor. The arrested development is complete when the adult Jesus replicates this dynamic, where crowds acclaim him, women fund him, yet he never learns to budget, build, or barter. The Magi gifts become the first installment in a lifelong subscription model where others pay for the privilege of proximity to chosenness. Mary, who internalized a divine narrative surrounding Jesus' birth, reinforced his fantasy. Tradition identifies Jesus as a tekton, which is a carpenter or artisan, who was trained under Joseph, yet the Gospels record no instance of him exercising this trade after age 12 and show him explicitly abandoning it to pursue itinerant preaching and miracles. He never mentions Joseph or invokes carpentry as vocation, evidence that the skill was acquired but deliberately discarded in favor of magical provision and messianic spectacle. Religious institutions further enforce a teleological career hierarchy, whereby only vocations explicitly serving divine mission earn moral credit. Success outside this hierarchy triggers 3 sequential scripts. First, demonization recasts achievement as idolatry, with sermons shifting to cautionary tales about worldly gain. Second, extraction follows. Financial success prompts intensified tithing demands and requests for loans or free services, while the underlying ambition is publicly shamed. Third, sabotage is enacted under the guise of piety. Refusal to comply elicits prayer circles for spiritual attack. Gossip that is not from God, or engineered micro-failures such as lost clients or planted rumors. Loyalty to institutional holiness renders neutrality heresy, positioning the successful individual as collateral damage in a purity audit. The harm manifests across multiple domains, because self-worth is then weaponized and each paycheck becomes a moral audit, and social isolation ensues as former pairs demand the individual remain diminished to safeguard their own narrative of obedience. The cruelty resides in its sanctification. Sabotage is presented as prophetic resistance. Christianity bifurcates into 2 narcissistic streams, orbiting the poverty cult of Jesus, yet serving opposite ego needs. The covert branch internalizes poverty as performative sacrament, embracing scarcity through renting rather than owning, refusing promotions, and tithing until empty. This positions adherents as living exegesis of the Beatitudes, with the subtext that only their level of deprivation earns divine favor. Prosperity adherents reframe the same Jesus through Old Testament restoration narratives, treating wealth as evidence of divine selection. They extract through seed faith theology while preaching that Jesus suffered so believers would not. Both streams weaponize poverty, one remaining in it to maintain moral altitude, the other by conquering it to display divine favor. This bifurcation reveals Christianity's foundational structure as a poverty cult stratified by chosenness. Jesus instructed universal adoption of the poverty mindset, like abandoning trades, relinquishing possessions, and reframing deprivation as spiritual currency, while reserving exemption for himself and his inner circle. The covert stream faithfully executes this mandate for the masses, ensuring perpetual material subordination. The prosperity stream claims the exemption Jesus modeled, positioning wealth as proof of divine election while demanding equivalent sacrifice from outsiders. Neither deviates from the original hierarchy. The system replicates Jesus' template with precision. Followers inherit engineered luck, leaders inherit engineered leverage, and the founder's dual instruction to praise deprivation and hoard devotion sustains the divine. Christianity constitutes a poverty cult for all except the truly chosen, preserving the exact hierarchy Jesus established through deliberate socio-economic bifurcation. The theological directives of Jesus concerning economic conduct embody a pathological evasion of material responsibility rather than a critique of wage exploitation. His command to sell all possessions and distribute them to the poor constructs an unsustainable dependency model that burdens the marginalized without structural reform. The exhortation to refrain from toil, illustrated by the lilies of the field, pathologizes anxiety over subsistence as spiritual deficiency, thereby absolving systemic injustice and shifting culpability to individual faith. Instructions to travel without purse or provisions normalize parasitic subsistence upon rural communities, reframing precarity as divine trust while masking the extractive nature of itinerant ministry. Despite possessing carpentry skills, Jesus abandons productive labor, a behavior consistent with cluster B avoidance of effort rather than principled renunciation. Consequently, modern wage labor is not condemned as enslavement but delegitimized as unbelief, reinforcing abuser dynamics where self-denial is valorized and basic provision condemned. The conclusion follows: Jesus offers no liberation from capitalism. He substitutes it with spiritual parasitism, demanding your resources while denying your right to secure them. Retain employment, reject guilt, and withdraw support from a figure who never earned his own.